It is. So welcome everyone back to this morning session of our beautiful conference. We still have two more talks to go this morning. The first one being Polaris's. Polaris works at the University of Turku in Finland. Is that right? And well, maybe you can say something about yourself, Polaris, for those who don't know you yet. And I'll give them the floor to you for your talk.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm a philosopher from the University of Turku in Finland. I'm a PhD candidate going to defend in November, and I'm also working as a senior researcher in a project that studies the use of nudging and other behavioral methods to help stop climate change. So this is just one of the weird things that philosophers can get up to. But other than behavioral methods, I'm interested in various phenomena related to psychology and psychiatry, and my PhD work is on self-control. And here I'm obviously doing the psychiatry angle. So the paper I want to present today is something that's very much a work in progress. And I'm presenting it for the first time now. So here I'm interested in this mundane observation that many of the behavioral traits that we associate with various psychiatric diagnoses can also be found in people who don't fulfill the diagnostic criteria. So for example, depressed mood or the trouble sleeping and suicidal ideation are traits that we associate with major depressive disorder, but they can also occur to varying extents in people without MDD. And one could say that all humans sometimes exhibit forgetfulness and trouble staying on task, but when exhibited at a larger frequency, they are associated with ADHD. So in this paper, I call these sorts of traits, that is behavioral traits that are subject to psychiatric interest, traits of interest. And the reason I use a term I came up with is that in most of the literature, these traits are discussed as symptoms. But I think that is only under the clinical gaze that traits like forgetfulness become symptoms, because a symptom implies a cause that's a discrete psychiatric entity. And when we look more deeply into the distribution of these traits across the population, it becomes glaringly obvious that we cannot presume a discrete psychiatric kind as a cause whenever such a trait is present. So it's only in the clinical context that traits become symptoms. And in what follows, I'll speak of traits mostly, and I'll speak of symptoms in relation to specific diagnoses only. So these traits are continuously but unevenly distributed throughout the population. That is, they do seem to cluster together in various ways, but that clustering does not necessarily cross the diagnostic threshold. For example, traits associated with autism are concentrated on the families of autistic people, including on family members who are not classified as autistic. It's not unusual to refer to such family members as being somewhere on the spectrum, a phenomenon also referred more formally to as the broader autism phenotype. Similarly, the notion of the schizophrenia spectrum indicates that the lines between schizophrenia and other diagnoses on the psychotic spectrum are blurred, and that traits associated with these diagnoses, such as hallucinations, also occur in the subclinical population to various degrees. So that the presence of traits of interest comes in degrees is entirely uncontroversial, a well-documented empirical fact. However, the controversy starts in how we want to conceptualize the relationship between traits and psychiatric constructs. For example, the approach in the DSM is very much a threshold model, where for most disorders, a sufficient concentration of traits signifies that applying a diagnostic label is appropriate. One competing approach, which I'm discussing here, is to say that it's not just the traits that are on a continuum. It's to say that the psychiatric constructs also are. It seems to me that many want to dismiss this option out of hand. They want to start with, okay, let's rule that option out first, because they have various worries about this option. And the two main worries that people tend to press are, first, that isn't saying that those constructs are on a spectrum or might be somehow coming in degrees. Isn't that somehow harmful or bad for neurodivergent people and psychiatric patients? And the second worry is that isn't it an obstruction to the aims of psychiatric science and clinical practice? However, I think the view put forth by some, namely that participation in the psychiatric categories should track participation in the associated traits, should really be taken into serious consideration. So I call this view the gradated participation view. It seems to me that we should neither accept nor dismiss it without seriously engaging with it, something that has not been done systematically to date. So for the gradated participation view, instead of one diagnostic threshold, qualities like major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, ADHD, or autism would be like cholesterol levels. It comes in degrees and merits clinical attention at some given threshold. The threshold is drawn on pragmatic grounds rather than tracking a discrete kind. So in other words, for this view, participation in psychiatric constructs tracks participation in traits of interest. And one can be a little bit depressed, a little bit schizophrenic, a little bit autistic. So this claim is something that can be interpreted as a claim about terminology or a claim about metaphysics. I'll treat it as a claim about terminology in this talk, staying clear of engaging with a metaphysical claim that the terminology might be a more accurate representation of the reference of these psychiatric concepts. So recall that diagnostic criteria for most psychiatric diagnoses require a set of symptoms to be present. There may be a threshold number of symptoms that needs to co-occur, or there may be a requirements of specific symptoms with the proviso that other symptoms can also be attributed to the diagnosis, or a combination of both. For example, the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder in DSM-5 are the following. More than 5 symptoms must be present during the same 2-week period. There needs to be a change from previous functioning, and symptoms clearly attributable to another medical condition do not count. And out of the symptoms, at least one of depressed mood and loss of interest or pleasure must be present. And the symptoms are listed as depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure, weight loss or gain, insomnia or hypersomnia, psychomotor agitation or retardation, fatigue, feeling worthless or excessive guilt, decreased concentration, and thoughts of death or suicide. Now, if we consider Jenny, who has decreased concentration, fatigue, and thoughts of suicide, Jenny cannot be diagnosed with MDD, nor is that combination of traits sufficient for any other psychiatric diagnosis without other considerations being present. Yet it's clear that Jenny is not thriving and needs help. For the gradated participation view, Jenny would have above average depression, even as she does not exhibit the full set of symptoms for MDD. So the upshot of gradated participation is, of course, not that everyone needs psychiatric attention. Rather, the view highlights that a need for psychiatric attention does not neatly track specific traits or participation in psychiatric constructs. Rather, psychiatric attention and intervention is required on pragmatic grounds, for example, for people whose traits result in marked decreases in quality of life. The task of the clinician is to help, not all who fall somewhere on the MDD continuum, but rather those who stand to benefit from that help. So for an example of the gradated participation view, I'll quote Stephen Ferroni and Henrik Larsson, who suggest that if we view ADHD as analogous to cholesterol levels, then diagnostic approaches should focus on defining the full continuum of ADHD traits, along with clinically meaningful thresholds for defining who does and does not need treatment, and who has clinically sub-threshold traits that call for careful monitoring. It's not just that traits of interest for a given diagnosis occur in degrees in the subclinical population, traits also cross-cut diagnoses. So someone with a given diagnosis may also have traits associated with another diagnosis, and some traits such as trouble sleeping, executive dysfunction, or repetitive behavior are associated with multiple diagnoses. So this complicates the gradated participation view. For example, there are shared structural and behavioral traits among autism and ADHD. So proponents of gradated participation can either grant that people with ADHD are also somewhat autistic and vice versa, or they can introduce the pragmatic caveat, also found in the DSM-5, that when one diagnosis is present, its constitutive traits should not be interpreted as signifying participation in other categories as well. So for the remainder of this talk, I will discuss the two main lines of arguments that have been leveled against the graded participation view. I will raise some objections to these main lines of argument, but I won't make the positive claim that the gradated participation view is correct or the best way to think of things. Rather, I want to just point out that the main lines of argument are not as successful as they seem to be assumed to be. So the first main line of argument against gradated participation is to say that gradated participation view may result in harms to psychiatric subjects. So phrases like "he's a little ADHD" or "I get pretty OCD sometimes" are often found inappropriate. Ordinarily, this argument also appeals not just to the trivialization of the psychiatric subject's experience, it also might appeal to insisting on the discreteness of the psychiatric kind on physiological grounds. But I won't engage the biological aspect of gradation here for time purposes. So for example, here's a snippet from autistic special tutor Chris Bonello's website appealing to trivialization. Quote, "When you tell an autistic person we're all a little autistic, I can almost guarantee that their first reaction will be to feel like you're trivializing their difficulties. And they're basically right. If everyone really were a little autistic, autism-friendly cinema screenings would not be a new thing." So he's clearly got a point there. And it's true that phrases like "she's a little ADHD" can obscure the fact that people with psychiatric diagnoses, for them, their disability or illness results in real significant burdens and requires corresponding accommodations. Occasional difficulties in focusing, for example, cause no significant burdens as people can compensate for them after a good night's sleep in a way that a person with ADHD cannot, because for a person with ADHD, it is a persistent problem rather than an occasional one. So there's very little work on this topic, and please do direct me to any systematic work that you've found. But perhaps the most nuanced work on this topic that I've come across comes from Lucien Spencer and Harvey Carroll. So their term for these harmful aspects of expressions like "a little OCD" is wrongful depathologization. Wrongful depathologization trivializes or does not acknowledge the psychiatric subject's illness while simultaneously retaining their stigma. So wrongful depathologization doesn't just refer to descriptions of psychiatric constructs as graded, also, although that can be a part of it, but also to descriptions of psychiatric subjects as just like everyone else, while simultaneously labeling them difficult or attention-seeking, again, retaining their stigma while not acknowledging their illness. Spencer and Carroll raised the case of OCD as one where people with OCD face trivializing attitudes from both lay people, friends, colleagues, family, and medical professionals, all of whom consider their illness less debilitating than it in fact is. This is attributable in large part to ignorance, and in the case of medical professionals, to willful ignorance about the nature of that disorder. Ignorance about the nature of OCD is further highlighted in the ways phrases like "a little OCD" are thrown about. People who characterize themselves as a little OCD typically mean that they are particularly conscientious, organized, or neat, rather than that their lives would be burdened by sub-threshold, unwanted, obsessive, or compulsive behaviors. But neatness, conscientiousness, or organization skills are not the traits of interest for OCD. Instead, obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors are. So as Spencer and Carroll point out, willful ignorance is a form of oppression and leads to people with OCD not getting the support, care, and accommodations they need. So it's important to make clear here that it's not at all my aim to defend misguided or ignorant statements to the effect that someone is a bit OCD because they're neat. Rather, my aim is to look into whether characterizing people who have some of the factual, not stereotyped, traits of interest for a given diagnosis as participating in that category in the same graded manner is as harmful as the clearly misguided phrases are. Now, there's two sources of harms that I can see here. One is that even for statements to the effect that someone is a little depressed, OCD, or so forth, that are grounded in the correct traits of interest and not in stereotypes, they can still obscure that living with this diagnosis is a far cry from the quirks of occasional struggles of thriving people. In other words, even if accurate, verbalizing the presence of traits of interest below the diagnostic threshold in this specific way fuel or enable a harmful discourse. The other possible source of harms is scarcity. Adequate mental health care is already hard to access for many people. Won't it be that much harder if professionals suddenly become concerned with people whose problems aren't even grave enough to merit diagnosis? Shouldn't we worry about those who need care the most, that is, people who do merit diagnosis? I have no factual answers to what in fact would happen if a discourse along the lines of graded participation would become mainstream. Instead, my response to these worries about harms is that these worries can be applied both ways. That is, the exact same worries can be raised about the burdens people below the diagnostic threshold sometimes live with. So first, Spencer and Carroll's worry with wrongful depathologization is in part that people with certain types of mental illness are just to be too ill to be free from stigma, but not ill enough to be taken seriously. However, note that it is not just the diagnosis that stigmatizes. Many traits of interest too carry significant stigma. For example, Jenny's fatigue and difficulty concentrating can be interpreted by people around her as suggesting she's lazy or just doesn't care. Appealing to diagnosis can help reduce these attitudes, but Jenny doesn't have that card in her hand. Jenny has to reckon with stigmatizing attitudes towards her traits, and her lack of diagnosis indicates she's not ill enough to be taken seriously. If Jenny could be described as having above average depression, we would have at least some sort of language to describe the way in which she is unwell. And we need some sort of language and tools to acknowledge the very real experiences of people below the current diagnostic thresholds. This is not to diminish in any way the double burden faced by people with stigmatized disorders who have to reckon both with the burden of that disorder and with the burden from stigma, both from the disorder label and from the traits. Again, remember that Spencer and Carroll level their argument against misguided phrases rather than ones grounded on the factual traits of interest for a given diagnosis. I have no qualms with that. I completely agree about all of that. But I want to point out that the same argument can be leveled in favor of acknowledging gradated participation. That by changing our labeling conventions in this way, we could conceivably decrease stigma and help acknowledge the burdens of some people whose difficulties currently go unacknowledged. The other harms objection stems from prioritization. So as it stands, some people with MDD have a hard time accessing proper psychiatric care. So why should we pay so much attention to Jenny when someone else has all the symptoms Jenny has, plus depressed mood and loss of pleasure, and is therefore clearly worse off? To this, I want to point out that burden of disease is not a result of symptoms alone. Rather, multiple factors, such as the extent to which that person has support and care, as well as whether that person is also dealing with other sorts of hardships, whether resulting from oppression or misfortune, have a tremendous impact on the burden of illness experienced by that person. For example, I'm currently at a situation where my ADHD, under my typical circumstances, causes comparatively little distress anymore. I have had the support means and times to develop ways of compensating for and coping with my hyperactive and inattentive traits to a significant degree. At an earlier time in my life, however, lacking safe accommodations or a steady income, I did not have the time, energy, or other resources required to manage my ADHD to that extent. And my burden of illness was much greater, resulting in projects never finished, various practical difficulties not reducible to living below the poverty line, and a sense of greatly diminished agency. Now, it's true that other things being equal, someone who crosses the diagnostic threshold should be prioritized simply because other things being equal, that person does need help more. But other things are rarely equal. Even if Jenny's traits are by themselves not as hard to cope with as those traits, but plus other traits, the burden from those traits can be harder to cope with if Jenny is not well placed to cope with those traits. So for example, if Jenny is dealing with other sources of stigma, if she is in an otherwise stressful or tiring life situation, or if she has limited access to food, shelter, and physical safety, those traits will, it seems to me, generate larger burdens for her than they do for someone whose life is otherwise in such a shape that she is well placed to deal with her traits. For example, if Jenny is a single mother and a sex worker, or if Jenny is homeless, or if she is a trans woman living with an abusive family, she, like me 10 years ago, will not be as well placed to cope with the burdens resulting from her traits of interest. In other words, for some people, subclinical traits of interest result in real significant burdens, social, well-being, economical, that can be as hard to deal with or harder than traits that cross the diagnostic threshold. Furthermore, these burdens do not neatly track the degree of participation in traits of interest. It is not simply that more traits would equal more burdens. Rather, factors such as overall health, socioeconomic status, and intersectional disadvantage may cause vulnerability, due to which quantitatively small participation in traits of interest results in burdens on par with quantitatively much greater participation. People with subclinical traits, however, receive neither acknowledgement nor accommodations for that burden. And given these burdens, psychiatry ought to be conceptually equipped to identify subclinical traits. As a result, I don't think we should simply devote our attention to those above the current diagnostic thresholds. I think instead there are some who don't meet the current diagnostic criteria, who have some traits of interest that are causing burdens in their lives and that we are currently not taking seriously because they are not ill enough. And that seems to be to cause harms to these unacknowledged people. For this reason, I think the harms argument against gradated participation fails, not because we couldn't conceive of ways in which graded participation can cause or enable a harmful discourse, but rather because we can also conceive of ways in which it could decrease harms currently experienced by unacknowledged people. And it's, of course, both of those, I think, are hypotheticals, but we can reasonably, we can take both of those as reasonable possibilities. So we can argue that we should deny graded participation in order to decrease harms, but we can also just as well argue that we should promote for graded participation in order to decrease harms. So the second reason to resist graded participation, I'll address only briefly. So graded participation can be resisted for reasons that have to do with the aims of psychiatry and clinical practice. Realists about mental disorder categories may worry that graded participation obscures the joint at which nature ought to be carved, whereas a concern for pragmatists is whether graded participation would decrease the clinical efficacy of categories as instruments of diagnostic practice. So my response to the realist is that graded participation in traits of interest is a well-documented phenomenon. So perhaps we should look at adjusting our categories so that they would better capture that phenomenon. If the agenda is carving nature at its joints, then that agenda in no way presupposes a nature made of discrete kinds. Perhaps nature includes continua. So that worry seems to be contingent on demonstrating psychiatric entities as discrete kinds, evidence for which continues to be sorely lacking. I have more sympathy for the pragmatist. However, if the goal of clinical practice is to help those who need to be helped, and the goal of categories is to help us accomplish that, then given the gravity of the burdens experienced by some people below the diagnostic threshold, it seems to me that the pragmatist needs to account for this somehow. Again, the argument leveled against graded participation can also be leveled in favor of it. We could say that graded participation gives the pragmatist the tools she needs in order to account for these burdens. So my preliminary conclusion at this time is that the above arguments against graded participation in psychiatric categories fail, at least in the form presented. However, I do refrain from making the positive claim that graded participation would be true. I invite the opponent of graded participation to demonstrate why these arguments should only be leveled in one direction. While claims about being a little ADHD or a bit OCD grounded on misconceptions and stereotypes are undoubtedly both false and damaging, it's not clear to me that the same would be true for a more accurate picture of gradated participation anchored on the actual traits of interest for each diagnosis. So the positive claim I do make, however, is that gradated participation in traits of interest ought to be acknowledged as a phenomenon that causes significant burdens to some people, pronouncedly so for people experiencing disadvantage on other axes. As traits of interest associated burdens demonstrate, however, a need for acknowledgement and accommodations may cross diagnostic boundaries. Crossing the clinical threshold is not the sole determinant of whether burdens generated by traits of interest merit acknowledgement and accommodations. We need language that helps us to also acknowledge burdens resulting from subclinical traits. Gradated participation is not the only way to generate that language, but since it can be used to further that aim, we should not dismiss it prematurely. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.